There are very few people who've thought as deeply about the issues we're dealing with today as our keynote speaker for this afternoon, Katherine Maher, who is the president and CEO of National Public Radio. In this role and in many previous ones, she's been an extraordinarily effective advocate for human rights and democratic freedoms. Before joining NPR, she was the CEO of Web Summit. She also served for 5 years as CEO of the Wikimedia Foundation, which hosts Wikipedia, one of the world's most popular digital platforms. Before that, she worked on rights, democracy, and innovation at Access Now, the World Bank, the National Democratic Institute, and UNICEF. All of that you probably already knew, but I will tell you something you probably didn't know about Katherine. In her capacity as CEO of Wikimedia, Katherine was also a client of the Knight Institute, which, with the ACLU, represented Wikimedia in a challenge to surveillance conducted by the National Security Agency. In court, the NSA defended its surveillance practices by arguing that the constitutional protections for free speech and privacy should apply with less force, or maybe not at all, to communications that cross the international border. Because the NSA successfully invoked the state secrets privilege, the courts didn't engage with that argument. But I thought it might be worth recognizing that the conversation we're having today about the meaning of constitutional protections and about the proper limits on government surveillance power is exactly the one we couldn't have in court. We're very lucky to have Katherine with us this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming her.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. And Jameel, thanks for the kind words. So I should preface this by saying, because I am a Wikipedian at heart, and because I work for a journalistic organization, I want to start by acknowledging I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of our work on the First Amendment and freedom of expression at Wikipedia. And also, I did not have the chance to fact check every single one of these stories with all of my colleagues. So in the words or the parlance of Wikipedia, trust but verify or check the citations. So I'm delighted to be with you here today within 100 miles of the US border. As you just heard from Jameel, I've been working on issues of freedom of expression for some time now in various capacities. And as global mobility and cross-border information flows continue to increase while freedom of expression space continues to decrease around the world, I truly appreciate the fact that you are all here working on these issues. I'm not an academic, but I am fascinated by some of the papers that were submitted for today's event and look forward to reading them more deeply in my free time. But I'm here to really speak from the perspective of a practitioner. As you heard, from 2014 to 2021, I was at the Wikimedia Foundation, which is an organization that is built on a few critical principles. Freedom of inquiry as enabled by user privacy and anonymity or pseudonymity. Freedom of expression as enabled by robust policies around the sharing of information, limited only by law or encyclopedic relevance. And freedom of assembly enabled by our shared digital spaces. And as a tertiary source, Wikipedia is built on secondary sources, such as peer-reviewed academic papers and reliable institutions of journalism, which are in turn built on the bedrock of freedom of expression, and notably, in certain cases, a history of courage as holders of knowledge and information and inquiry sustained information that was considered critical or threatening in certain jurisdictions where it was outlawed in others. At Wikipedia, we could not do our work without a robust and thriving free press or academic freedom any more than you can build a house on an unstable foundation. So I say that just to recognize the shoulders of giants that we all stand on when we construct knowledge. Of course, the internet and cross-border global mobility has also made it much more challenging to earmark oppression by freedom or geography oppression or freedom by geography. And as a result, we know that technical tools and legal tools for censorship have also grown more sophisticated, which reminds me of one of my favorite Wikipedia stories from some of our early days. In 2009, an editor on French Wikipedia wrote an article about a signals intelligence listening station in a rural part of the country, just outside Lyon. The listening station was not a secret. It was widely known to exist by the surrounding community and was actually the subject of a French television program where I think they went inside and they interviewed an officer based at the station. I think it was about sort of the employment opportunity that the station provided to the local community. But it's one thing for this knowledge to exist locally, and it's an entirely other thing for this knowledge to exist online, where anyone in the world could find it. So in 2013, in a vain attempt of security by obscurity, which we all know works very well, the French Internal Security Services demanded that the Wikimedia Foundation take the article down. As was policy, we reviewed the page, found nothing illegal, and refused. They then hauled in the Parisian Wikipedia editor who was closest to them, directing him to use his admin privileges to take the article down. Despite explaining this would be futile, he complied because they threatened him with detention and charges. The article was promptly restored by an editor in Switzerland, outside of French jurisdiction. And in a classic example of the Streisand effect, the article was expanded and went from only 60 viewers to more than 10,000. So those were heady days. Information wants to be free, of course. And as Wikipedia expanded, we found ourselves it was clear that we were on a collision course with issues of freedom of expression globally, where the bounds of acceptable speech varied dramatically from those safeguarded by the First Amendment. While we were headquartered in the United States and very deliberately built a hosting infrastructure that anchored around US presence with very lightweight cached infrastructure, lily pads, and strategic non-US jurisdictions, none of these efforts were fail-safe for our people or our community, who, like that French editor, were often subject to harassment and at times detention, arrest, and imprisonment for their work on Wikipedia. So I would be remiss if I didn't note that as we speak, there are multiple people around the world serving time for their participation as encyclopedia editors. In Belarus, editor Mark Bernstein was doxxed, arrested, and is currently serving a sentence of 3 years of limited mobility for his edits to Russian Wikipedia about the Ukraine invasion. In 2022, editor Pavel Pernikau was sentenced to 2 years in a penal colony for 2 edits of Wikipedia related to Belarusian political repression. And more significantly, at least in some ways for my mind, in Saudi Arabia, Arabic Wikipedia administrator Osma Khaled has been sentenced for 32 years for, per Wikipedia, swaying public opinion and violating public morals by making edits critical about the persecution of political activists in the country. His friend and fellow admin, Ziad al-Sufyani, was sentenced to 8 years. I know both of these men personally. They are doctors, primarily involved in editing Wikipedia to improve the content and quality of medical articles. So while in the United States, Wikipedia may only be an encyclopedia, outside the United States, it remains very much a contested tool of power. In 2017, I was 1 year into my tenure as the executive director of Wikimedia Foundation when we received notice from the Turkish government of an objection to information contained within 2 pages on English Wikipedia. They requested that we change or remove the information, or we would face the risk of Wikipedia being blocked across the country, a country with more than 80 million people. In 2015, we'd migrated all of Wikipedia to HSTS, or HTTP Strict Transport Security. And although Wikipedia was already available via HTTPS, this was a significant change to move to encryption by default. And it wasn't uncontroversial at the time, because at that point, many countries had adopted a practice of selective Wikipedia blocks, meaning if you were, say, in Qatar, you might not find a certain article, but you could largely access the rest of Wikipedia. Moving to HSTS would not only prevent such blocks, but since the protocol, as a protocol, it enabled us to forward secure the sites for a designated period of time. We chose 1 year. It also bound our hands so that if we were under pressure to undo the security layer, we wouldn't be able to. We were committed on a rolling basis going forward. It was, in some ways, a cute cat gamble to mangle poor Ethan Zuckerman. In 2008, Zuckerman wrote that the majority of people, the cute cat theory of activism, wrote that the majority of people are uninterested in social activism, but they are interested in cute cats or any suitable, quotidian internet behavior, from pornography to sports fandom, and build social and sharing platforms for these purposes that often prove to be useful for activists as well. And he went on to argue that because very few people like activism, but many people like cute cats, it's difficult for governments to censor these platforms without making the cute cat people mad and inadvertently politicizing them so that they would move from an otherwise neutral social platform and its user community into a more politicized space. So this was our cute cat gamble. We wanted to encrypt all of Wikipedia so that all of it would be available. And it mostly paid off. Most countries made the choice that all of Wikipedia was better than none. And so Iran, for example, went from being partially available to totally available. And a few others, such as China, most notably, went in the other direction. As of today, we are still blocked there. In 2015, we had a brief issue in Russia where the cute cat theory largely prevailed. The Russian censorship agency, Roskomnadzor, was dissatisfied with an article related to cannabis. A court in the eastern part of the country filed a blocking injunction, and we briefly went 404, only to re-emerge a few hours later following public outcry. Wikipedia editors in Russia had played a game of chicken with the censor, and not by removing the article, but with a flurry of edits that increased its scientific and sociological value, claimed victory. So did the censor, but mostly so did the Wikipedians. At the time, The Verge reported an EFF employee as saying, "These are kind of the first real-world tests. By making these decisions more all or nothing, even the governments we tend to disagree with politically will realize that nothing isn't an option." I wish that were still true. In 2017, we found ourselves playing brinkmanship again, but this time with the Turkish government of President Erdogan, who has now held the presidency or leadership of Turkey for 21 years. Erdogan's administration was reportedly displeased with two articles on English Wikipedia, one on state-sponsored terrorism, which cited reports that Turkey was providing arms to the Islamic State in the Levant, and the second objection was a little bit more personal, on foreign involvement in the Syrian civil war, referencing an alleged controversy involving the family of Erdogan, his own immediate family, purchasing and smuggling oil across the border, directly funding the Islamic State. It was at this point we got a letter. And we often got letters at Wikipedia, notice of suit for some reason or another. There's a reason that the legal team at Wikipedia for many years had a life-size Chewbacca cutout at the entrance to their desks. They were the anti-censorship resistance, small and mighty. So of course, at this point, we had a few choices to make. Usually when we got letters like these, we sort of reviewed a couple different courses of action. One was do nothing, which is often the right choice when receiving a letter without any legal basis or jurisdictional basis, raising an issue about a well-reported, well-cited Wikipedia article. We would respond politely and let everyone know we weren't going to do anything about it. The second option was to censor Wikipedia, which I want to be very clear, we would never do that. The Wikimedia Foundation not only operates the Wikipedia sites, but we take pains to differentiate between our hosting duties and that of user-generated content versus editorial or publishing decisions. Wikimedia Foundation does not control the editorial policies of the community, and had we made changes to the pages, which again, we would never do, someone, like that Swiss editor, would have invariably put them back up. Further, we were always very concerned about the slippery slope argument. The moment that we would take one article down, it would be instant leverage for any state anywhere to block us until we removed content that offended them, which is why we never made it technically possible. Every single page on Wikipedia is available for editing in a single definitive instance, so we couldn't selectively block country by country. You couldn't see multiple versions of the same page. It's just not feasible based on the architecture that we use. And we always felt like it was impossible to prove a negative. If we ever found ourselves in a place where readers could have reasonable concern that we had omitted something and silently removed pages, that would be trust that we would never be able to recoup. So, never censor Wikipedia. But we could notify the community, and so we do. Wikipedians ultimately have policy control, and within their guidelines, they can choose to make editorial changes to an article, add additional sources or context or scope. They can improve the article if the information is not well cited. They are also information activists, not political activists. And the act of informing them about the consequences of editing allows them to be able to make decisions about how to evaluate their own circumstances and participation. We notified the Wikimedia community in Turkey. They declined to make changes to the pages. They let us know they'd prefer it be blocked than censored. And as in the case of Russian Wikipedia, they improved them, increasing citations, which unfortunately for our discontented president, only elaborated on the issues of his concern. We stayed blocked in Turkey for more than 2 years, starting in April 2017. We were the issues of reporting, documentaries, and political campaign promises. Wikipedia was mirrored and hosted by third parties who took advantage of its freely licensed content to run versions of the site that were in fact censored. And I actually don't know whether Wikipedians were more upset by the censorship or the fact that the mirrors ran ads. We enlisted counsel, working with Turkish internet law and freedom of expression scholars Yaman Akdeniz and Kerem Altıparmak, to challenge these blocks in the Turkish court. And we failed on 2 cases, of course, but appealed all the way up to the Turkish Constitutional Court, which is their equivalent of the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, just to hear crickets for 2 years. While we waited, with these delays being so significant, we also took the case to the European Court of Human Rights, arguing that the block was a violation to the right of freedom of expression. Because the delay had dragged on for so long, the court expedited our case, drawing attention of international rights bodies. And finally, in December 2019, the court lifted the ban, 10-6, finding in our favor. I'm always struck by, during the time of this block, 49,000 new articles were added to Turkish Wikipedia, either by Turkish speakers outside of Turkey or people using circumvention software. So despite the fact that this was not available to people within the country, they still continued to build free knowledge. So this is perhaps an argument that information doesn't know borders, but perhaps not, because these issues were never limited just to countries abroad. In the aftermath of Edward Snowden's 2013 leaks, and I'm going to speak a little bit about what Jameel was just referencing, disclosing the widespread use of mass surveillance in the United States and programs by the NSA, various organizations brought challenges to the practice, and most notably, the ACLU's litigation on behalf of Amnesty International and Amnesty v. Clapper, whose case against James Clapper, who was the director of national intelligence at the time, went before the Supreme Court before being dismissed on the basis of standing. The court found, I'm radically simplifying this, that Amnesty's claim that their privileged communication with clients was being intercepted was too speculative to proceed. Wikipedia was among those technology platforms named in the leaked materials as a target for HTTP surveillance. This was before we'd made the switch to HSTS. And we felt as though, with the failure of the Amnesty case, it was time for us to file our own suit, again, represented by the ACLU, represented by Jameel, thank you so much, and along with pro bono counsel from Cooley, which was one of our law firms at the time, challenging the NSA's mass surveillance program known as Upstream. We saw the case as an opportunity to stand up for our values, not just abroad, where we'd been doing it for some time, but here in the US, for the rights of Americans, the rights of those living in the United States, but as well the sort of consequent potential beneficial impacts that reducing this disproportionate surveillance would have on our communities around the world. The chilling effect that our editors and readers experience knowing that their communications were caught up in a dragnet. And this impact was very real, not just in terms of the data that we saw around readership of sensitive articles, but the conversations that we would have with individuals who themselves felt subjected to that chilling effect. I remember having a conversation with an American Wikipedia editor based in DC who was a long-term humanitarian technologist. He worked on humanitarian development overseas. He was in the process of applying for security clearance for a new job and told me that he'd stopped reading sensitive articles about the war on terror because he was concerned that his behavior would be misconstrued. We filed suit for this reason on behalf of that editor and every other one of the hundreds of thousands of editors around the world and our more than 1 billion readers. For our American readers, this was a violation of their First and Fourth Amendment rights, and more broadly, a violation of the universal rights to privacy, free expression, and free inquiry for all of those around the world. As you heard, from 2015, we faced an uphill climb. Our case was initially dismissed, but the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals found that we had plausible standing given the enormity of all of our digital communications and sent the case back to the district court. In 2018, it was dismissed again on the basis of state secrets. We appealed one more time to the Fourth Circuit, which this time upheld the government's position that our litigation infringed on state secrets. And in 2023, nearly a decade after the initial leaks and almost a decade after we'd filed suit, our petition for hearing in front of the court was ultimately denied and the case was dismissed, meaning that, as you heard Jameel say, these issues have never truly gotten an airing. Today, I'm at NPR, which is the largest public media news organization in the country. We broadcast through 247 member stations, work with 200 newsrooms and 3,000 public media journalists in all 50 states and Guam. Our reporting is on the airwaves that cover more than 99% of the geographic United States. We're there when no other news can make it through. In the aftermath of Hurricane Helene's ravaging of North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, when the internet and electricity were down, public radio's reporters were there to provide life-saving information, and you saw photographs of people huddled around radios at the ends of their driveways sharing the news, sneakernet, writing down what they were hearing and walking it to their neighbors who weren't able to be so mobile. As a news media organization, we are on the front lines of the right to free expression. And as some of you have explored for the session today, the right of American citizens to know not just what's happening in their country, but around the world. The freedoms of the First Amendment make it possible for our reporters to pursue stories through Freedom of Information Act requests, including a recent Murrow Award-winning story by our own Daniel Estrin on the deaths of Syrian civilians during a U.S. military operation targeting Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, which led to the introduction of legislation requiring the Pentagon to review cases of civilian harm. These freedoms also allow our journalists to cross the border and report on what is happening abroad, thanks to our journalists and producers stationed in nearly 20 foreign bureaus around the world, and the many others who travel on assignment, most recently in both Ukraine and the Middle East. These are vital freedoms. We take this responsibility very seriously. As a public media organization, our single responsibility is the right of citizens to know. We view ourselves as the scaffolding of democracy. And that is very much aligned with this First Amendment right that we're all here to discuss today. It is a bedrock, and it must be protected. It allows us to ensure our citizens can know and hold our officials to account, not just at the ballot box, but through all of the other mechanisms of democracy that are available to us. So thank you for your continued work on these issues, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Katherine. So if we had won that case against the NSA, I would be very happy to take all the credit. But since we lost, I feel obliged to note that other lawyers who represented you are here too. So
thank you for all your work.
Alex Abdo and Patrick Toomey and Ashley Gorski are all here.
Thank you. It's wonderful to hopefully put some names to the faces to the names that I remember from so many emails and briefs. So thank you.
So I want to start by asking you a question about press freedom. So this has been, as we all know, an extraordinarily grim time for press freedom, with so many journalists around the world imprisoned or even killed for their work. I wanted to ask you whether the climate for press freedom globally has affected NPR's ability to inform its listeners about the world outside the United States, and more broadly, whether you think the climate for press freedom globally is affecting Americans' ability to understand the world.
Very tangibly, it has affected our ability to inform. We used to have a correspondent based in Beijing. She's now based in Taiwan, in Taipei, because it's impossible to have her full-time there. We are one of the only organizations that has had a correspondent out of Moscow for the last few years after Evan's detention from the Wall Street Journal, that has become an increasingly precarious consideration and something that we think very deeply about in terms of our capacity to report meaningfully from Russia and also maintain the safety and security of our people. We have had to, I'm trying to think if there are other instances where we've actually had to pull folks out. I mean, we send people into countries. We just had one of our correspondents come back from Sudan. We've had folks in Venezuela recently. It has certainly made us, I don't want to say more cautious, but we have to take additional precautions in order to be able to ensure that we're reporting and reporting well. To this day, I think we're one of the only organizations that still has someone on the ground in Gaza as well. We have a stringer there, Anas, who has been remarkable in being able to ensure that we're able to report what's going on from the perspective of Gazans. And does it affect our ability for Americans to know? I don't see how it couldn't. I don't see how it couldn't. I think that it is a tried and true tactic as well of, and this is, I'm speaking about my experience outside of NPR as well, of authoritarian states to close off avenues to accountability in the broader global remit is silencing journalism at home and preventing foreign correspondents from being able to report from within. And so it's not simply that the American public doesn't know. There are many stories that the global public has no access to today, and I think that that has consequential implications for the ways in which we conduct foreign policy around the world.
Let me ask you a related question about the challenge of foreign disinformation, which is a challenge that has come up several times already today and will probably come up again this afternoon. So I think it's probably fair to say that democratic governments around the world are acting very aggressively now to protect their citizens from what the democratic governments at least characterize as foreign disinformation. Here in the United States, the Treasury Department has sanctioned RT and Sputnik, and as a result, Americans can't access these media organizations that are state media for Russia. Congress has banned Americans from accessing TikTok. What should our attitude be towards those kinds of interventions? On one hand, I think we can all agree foreign disinformation is a terrible thing. It's a real thing. It sometimes a consequential thing, although there's a real debate about how consequential. But on the other hand, we don't generally allow or trust the government to protect us from misinformation or disinformation in other contexts. So is foreign disinformation different? Should we think about it differently?
The million, billion, $1 trillion question.
We actually have a whole symposium about this. So,
yeah. And what were the answers? I think about this in the context. I was just at the Public Broadcasters International Conference, which is a gathering of public media broadcasters, which is different than state media broadcasters. And included there were representatives from some of the international arms of these organizations, like Deutsche Welle. We have Voice of America here in the United States, which broadcasts outside. And it is unquestionably an action of influence that we are, by funding media organizations that operate, even, I will not question or impugn the journalistic credentials of Voice of America, that's not at all what I'm saying, but it is unquestionably an argument that we fund that work in order to be able to advance our values. And our values in this instance are freedom of expression and freedom of inquiry. And I know that one of the arguments is that that's exactly what these other entities are attempting to do, is advance a certain set of values, whether it is the Turkish broadcaster, which has made significant investments over the course of the last few years in purchasing access to television broadcast rights all over sub-Saharan Africa. It is a means of forward projection of influence, economic influence, political influence, and the like. I don't know that I am particularly comfortable with pulling things down off broadcast spectrum and channels. I think that it is... I think we are at a place where we find ourselves, as we get accustomed to blockers with regards to what sort of information we should have access to over public airwaves, I think that that is a dangerous, concerning precedent. But I do admit that I'm of multiple minds, because I was at Wikipedia and we know how disruptive, pernicious, and active some of these campaigns to undermine credible information are, and how well-funded they are.
I guess one question is whether we could address the real risks presented by these kinds of campaigns with mechanisms other than suppression, right? Whether, you sort of mentioned offhand the possibility of transparency around all of this, but maybe there are transparency mandates that we could impose.
Well, transparency mandates, I think transparency is very useful. I'm a fan of transparency. I also don't think transparency is a substitute for communication and understanding. And, we can become overwhelmed at times by transparency. There's this sort of obfuscation via transparency that can occur. And I'm specifically, dump the documents, dump the data. People are overwhelmed by what information to pay attention to or listen to. I'm not arguing against transparency. I just don't think it's necessary but not sufficient. I really wish that we were approaching this less from what do we block and more what do we build. And this to me comes back to the fact that as we look around the country today, there is such a devastation of credible news organizations at the local level. So forgive me for getting on my soapbox for a second, but 85% of Americans believe that local news is a net good. That is a bipartisan agreement that Americans have across the country, that local news is something that is meaningful to their communities and that it should be supported. Only 15% of Americans are willing to pay for local news, which is a problem, but 85% of Americans believe that local news has meaningful, positive impact in their communities. And where you see communities that still have local media organizations, you see lower rates of partisanship, higher rates of voter and civic participation. These are positive correlated outcomes with access to journalism and scrutiny that happens at the local level. And that existence of local news also, I believe, has a transitive property to confidence in other forms of news. We saw this when I was at Wikipedia. If you trusted your local article about your hometown, you would have transitive trust to other articles that were of greater abstraction relative to familiarity to you. So when we divest from local news, whether it's an individual matter of choice or because private equity is stripping media organizations for value, whatever the case may be, what we're actually doing is harming the context of information integrity in our own environment, disrupting trust and undermining the foundations of the ability of people to have credible context for how to evaluate information, and creating a distance between whether I trust news writ large versus any source of information. So rather than start with let's block external influences, I would far prefer that we are building the competence and qualifications of folks to understand the media environment. I also think that the media itself has a role to play here. We do not spend nearly enough time explaining how journalism works. And I'm not talking media literacy. I'm talking about the fact that every single journalist adheres to a code of standards and ethics that their organizations and their J schools, including the one here at Columbia, inculcate at the earliest stages of the profession. And the profession itself is self-regulating. Journalists look to other journalists and apply high degrees of scrutiny as to their qualifications and their competence in terms of upholding these ethics. And we almost never explain these to the public in a way that doesn't sound patronizing and doesn't sound as though we're teaching you how to read the news.
So I want to ask you one last question.
Sorry, that was a little bit of a... So I told you I was going to climb on my soapbox. I apologize.
Well, so I want to ask you about the internet as a tool for democratization. So for a long time, we used to think that the internet would be a tool for democratization, and in many ways, I think it has been. But it's increasingly been a tool for domestic and transnational repression as well. And you have thought about the internet a lot, especially in your role at Wikimedia. And so I'm curious to know, are you still optimistic about the internet's democratic possibilities? Find a way to say yes.
I mean, look, it's technology is not good nor bad, nor is it neutral, right? It is good and it is bad, and it ends up mirroring the proclivities that we have as human beings and replicating the same structures of our societies in many ways. And in this particular instance is an amplifying tool that allows for those who seek to create harm at scale. I think that one of the things that I've always been struck by is all of our normative expectations about privacy and speech are based on centuries of evolution of those norms. So the example I always use on a privacy basis is Germany and the Netherlands, right? They're right next to each other. And in Germany, you keep your shades closed and your windows. It's very important that you keep your shades closed because it's a matter of privacy and it's actually a matter of respect for your neighbors. And in the Netherlands, you keep your shades open to demonstrate that you have nothing to hide and you're a good, upstanding citizen. And this all sounds totally reductive, but it's functionally true. These are norms that are, and yet both societies have a deep and abiding commitment to privacy that is both part of their national legislation and part of their participation in the broader European project. And they have totally different means by which they enact those experiences of privacy. I think about this because our expectations and norms around how we communicate the bounds of speech, the bounds of harm, the bounds of privacy are very much based on sort of the speaker's corner in the public park. They're very much based on communal norms. And they have grown to the size of the nation state over the years because we have had a system that allowed them to grow and test within constructs of precedent over time. The internet does not have that. The internet is asking us to apply these normative expectations, which may vary country to country, culture to culture, as I just gave the example of these two countries that sit side by side with many, many consistent value sets, apply those at the scale of 4 billion people or 5 billion people at this point. We do not have a means by which we can negotiate those edge cases where those values collide and how we actually govern the application of that. So is the internet a good thing? In many ways, it has advanced so much of our quality of life and particularly closed the delta on issues in places, I started my career at UNICEF, where infrastructure had always failed to serve the needs of people, of civilians, in terms of their basic human needs. That is an unqualified good. How we work out these norms over a 30, 40-year period when we've always had centuries to figure it out, that is the sort of existential challenge of the day.
Katherine, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.